Good morning. Happy Friday, Friday the 13th, actually. This is uh, very providential, perhaps, for an episode on Friday, March 13th, uh, episode 52 of PatristiCast. I'm your host, John Solheid. As always, help spread the word of this channel. Click that like and subscribe button and get alerted to more content as it comes out. Today, I am very pleased to welcome Reverend Gabby Thomas, who is currently Associate Professor of Early Christianity and Anglican Studies at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. However, on June 1st, she is going to begin her next adventure as Dean of the Berkeley Divinity School and Professor of Early Christian, Anglican, and Theological Studies at Yale University. And today we are going to discuss her forthcoming book, The Problem of the Devil in Cappadocian Thought. Uh, Gabby, welcome to PatristiCast. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so where to begin? Well, like I said, March 13th, perhaps, very appropriate that we have a discussion of the devil. What got you interested in this subject? Kind of talk about that story and then how your research evolved and what your experience was like.
Thanks for asking that because there wasn't a straightforward way into this at all. So I started out very long time ago now, looking at what it means to be made according to the image of God. So originally, when I first started graduate research, I was interested in questions of deification
Mhm.
and all things beautiful and lovely and how we become like God, etc., etc. And I was particularly interested exploring that question through the lens of Gregory of Nazianzus,
Mm.
who was fourth century theologian that I had absolutely fallen in love with his work. Um, those were my questions. Was for him, what does it mean to be divine? What does it mean to be made according to the image of God? And I really wasn't thinking about Satan at all. That was my question. I was really interested in theological anthropology, which I still am to a certain extent. But that was my primary question. And as I worked on that question, what I noticed with him was there's a pattern whereby a lot of the time when he's talking about what it means to be divine, what it means to image God, he also talked about the devil in a way that suggested that those two sort of were featuring for him in a way that there are some dots joining that there weren't for me. Because when I think about being human, I don't automatically think about Satan, right? And so I was just like, oh, this is a really interesting pattern. And I got into sort of making spreadsheets and that kind of thing and wrote up that book. So that was the first book, What It Means to Be Made According to the Image of God in the Theology of Gregory of Nazianzus. And I was left at the end of that with all these questions around like why is he so interested in the devil? Why does he talk about him so much? But why does he not really describe him very clearly? What actually is the devil in his mind? How do we understand him? Is he really defeated? And is everyone else saying the same as him? And so I was sort of just left with a series of questions. And I think the reason I found the whole sort of area really worth pursuing was that I noticed a theme that at the time when I went and talked about it at conferences or when I started talking about the devil with colleagues, that on the whole, there was just a general sort of reticence around, is that something you should be studying?
Mhm.
And I think on the whole that you could sort of divide it into different categories. Sometimes there was a sense of, do we want to study the devil? Because that's a bit dangerous, maybe. And I had to explain that studying doesn't equal sympathy. I'm not going to start being sympathetic to the devil because I'm studying him. So that was sort of one sort of pushback that I got. Another line of thought tended to be, well, we all know now that there are lots of ways of answering all of the problems that the devil answered for the early Christians. So we have science, and we can think we don't really need the devil now in our theology or to help us with anything. And that's pretty much what he was. He was a tool, and we have better tools now.
Mhm.
So what you're doing is largely irrelevant. So that was like a second kind of pushback. But then there was another strand of people when I went to conferences and when I began sort of asking the questions for this next book, who were, oh, how interesting. Wow, tell me more.
Mhm.
And I think they ended up being my sort of main interlocutors as I moved forward. But I think it was the amount of sort of discomfort that made me think, actually, there's something really worth studying in this. Because clearly there's something that's just fundamentally a little bit unsettling about it. And because I'm at heart a patristic scholar, whilst I like delving into lots of other areas too, but this is my primary passion and world and love. And so I was like, I really want to know more about what Gregory of Nazianzus is doing, but to get a better view of how he sits, I'll look at his friends as well,
Mhm.
his frenemies, we might
Yeah,
say, in certain
yeah.
instances. So let's see a bit of what Basil's doing. Let's see a bit of what Gregory of Nyssa's doing, and then also Macrina as well. And let's sort of place him in conversation so that I can get a broad overview of, at least in the fourth century, what are the different ways of understanding who the devil is and
Mhm.
sort of what power he had and that kind of thing.
Very interesting. You talk about uh, uh, studying Nazianz and deification, and you noticed how in his discussions he includes, the opposite possibility, almost being I don't even know, devilization or something like that. I don't know what it would be, but it reminds me of, and you don't get into it in your book, so we don't have to talk about, but on I have to bring up Origin. I just can't help myself.
Of course.
And for the audience who might criticize me for it, too bad. Um, he has this wonderful homily in his recently discovered Greek homilies on the Psalms. It's for him it was homily on Psalm 81. So in our
No, I've just published
you published a paper on that.
on that psalm. Yeah,
Is this
yeah. So
on
carry
the
on.
Psalm
This
or
is
on
very
Origen's homily
exciting.
on it? Was it on Origen's homily on it or just on the Psalm?
No, no, on Origen's homily on that psalm and the devil.
So I have one in early Christianity, the journal Early Christianity. I don't focus on the devil at all, but he does, and he has this wonderful thing. He says, it's like we are in the theater of the world,
Yep,
and just like characters or actors in the theater, we can wear masks,
yep,
prosopha, and, if we wear the mask of God or Jesus through imitation of them or doing what they tell us we should be doing, we become deified, body, soul, and spirit. Of course, if we do the opposite, if we
yep,
imitate the devil and the demons, we take on their characteristics to the sense that we almost become them. So it seems to me that there is this necessary secondary follow-up to questions of deification. What if we do the opposite? And what does that suggest about the anthropology that's driving these writers
yeah,
in these discussions? Because on the one hand, for Origin, the devil was not created devil. He was an angel, of course, and he became devil through habituating himself to evil actions to the point where it's almost as if he cannot turn around. Origin will maintain that he keeps his rational faculties, even if they're disfigured to such an extent that it's possible he can never turn around. But the
yep,
the potential is there.
yep.
Um, and so I think these are very interesting questions that we should be asking. So your book then asks these questions with respect to the Cappadocians. And one of the things I appreciate, so when we talk about the Cappadocian fathers, the ones we think about, Basil, Nazianz, and Nyssa, Oftentimes, the sister, Basil and Nissa's sister, gets left out, but she plays a very prominent role, at least in Nissa, and probably even in Basil's formation. So you include her. Why? Well, maybe you answered this in your first answer, but why address this question with respect to the Cappadocians and not say um, Athanasius or Augustine or why the
Yeah.
Cappadocians?
So for me, it was partly because I was so confident after what I'd read about with Gregory of Nazianzus that there was something worth really pursuing for them. I think for me, it was the fact that these are conversation partners that we have looked at with regard to the doctrine of the Trinity in really quite a lot of detail.
Mhm.
There are so many books written on fourth century Trinitarian doctrine that include these figures. And so, what I wanted to do was to sort of say, well, we have these figures. We know they're important for the doctrine of God. We know that they contribute significantly to questions of Christology, definitely with pneumatology. Um, so, let's broaden that out and look at what they're saying theologically about the devil, too. I specifically wanted people in conversation with each other because I wanted to highlight that whilst there are some characteristics and some threads that you can pull through, as the one you just stated in
Mhm.
terms of what the devil was originally, etc., and what he doesn't become, there are also some major differences in terms of how they're responding to the various problems that even having a devil in your theological worldview creates. And so it was a sense of wanting to have these conversation partners, but also wanting to have conversation partners that were in conversation with one another as well. Moana Ludlow wrote a fantastic book a few years ago on art, craft, and theology, where she thinks through methodologically why we should still continue to place them together now, even
Mhm.
though we know that for various reasons, lots of people have questioned whether we should, that kind of thing. And she put them together and calls it a workshop. And she looks at the way that they relate to one another and the way that ancient craftsmen and women would relate in a workshop. And I was really taken with that idea. I thought it was a really good one. And so I thought, what if they were workshopping what it means to fight with the devil and what it means to deal with the devil's problems? So I very explicitly borrowed her idea and started sort of playing around really in the beginning of ideas of, what does it mean for these people to be basically apprentices at spiritual warfare, really? But for that to include questions of theology, so that it wasn't just relegated to the world of practice or experience, but it really encompasses, all of it. I need to come back to the origin question at the end, though, because I'm very excited about that now.
Okay, okay. You can do that now if you would like. Just so
It
you don't
probably makes
forget.
more sense if we come back to the
Come back
end
to it later.
because it's
Okay.
with the what's next.
Okay.
But yeah,
So, yeah, so we'll end this conversation with what comes next. So let me ask another introductory question before we actually get into some of the details of your book.
sure.
Um, am I right in concluding that you have a bit of a bone to pick in this book? Um, in your intro, you talk about, in the modern world, even in the scholarly world, the devil, when we talk about the problem of the devil, there's a tendency to psychologize it. It's just something that occurs, mentally. It's about internal struggles, so on and so forth. There's not an ontological being per se. Um, Now that I think that's right. I think there is a almost an allergic reaction in the contemporary world to discussions of the devil. But then you get Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, who talked about the devil quite a bit and said we should actually think more about the devil.
Yeah.
So am I right in thinking that you have a bone to pick with some of that, some of the allergies to the devil, or is that maybe too much?
Um, I think a bone to pick is um, a little too much. I guess I wanted to present another way of thinking about this where we actually take it seriously, and that we can begin to ask questions where we don't immediately run to the, oh, well, that was the ancients. We don't need to worry about that now in quite in the same way. I think for me, it was just when I was sort of doing the sort of like early phases of a literature review where you're just reading everything and anything. There was such a common theme of the early Christians invented the devil for ways of explaining evil in the world.
Mhm.
And I sort of had almost adopted that because that view was so widespread that I sort of came to the text almost with that approach.
Mhm.
And it was only when I was actually reading everything that I realized, oh no, they really didn't. That was certainly not in the fourth century. That's absolutely not what's happening. And so partly it was to just, I guess, clarify a few misconceptions that we have in the contemporary sort of scholarly world, I think, and non-scholarly world around quite what's going on and how he's emerging as a sort of character through this story of salvation. And then in terms of the modern theology, I guess, I mean, the Catholic scholars, I mean, you have Rana and Ratzinger, they're doing a really good job of defending him for sure and defending the place of it, but not so much with Protestant theology. That it took the devil took a real hit in that particular strand, and it's only more recently that scholars have begun to readdress that and look at that question. And so partly it was a little bit of a pushback at that Protestant tradition that had more or less got to a point of saying, yeah, we don't really need this. I mean, you have like the likes of Schleiermacher and co. and sort of, well, we can do without this. And then also ways of demythologizing texts
Mhm.
whereby, yeah, we can talk about death, and death replaces the devil, and they're the same thing, and it all merges in. And so we don't need this independent character anymore.
Mhm.
It's is a bit of a pushback at that because actually, certainly for the Cappadocians, there are times when you cannot tell whether they're talking about death as an independent
Yeah.
figure or a personification or the devil or actual death as in dying,
Mhm.
because those things begin to merge in places. But in other places, it's very, very clear that there is a distinction between these three.
Mhm.
And so it was that sense of wanting to reclaim the clarity that's there and then also flag up some of the problems and the mysteries, in a sense, that are there that are not resolved by the time you read all of their work.
Mhm.
So there's no sense of by the time I finished writing, I was just like, I'm not going to try and resolve these problems because they're not resolving these problems. So what I was doing was saying, look, these are the problems that we're left with, and this is how they're trying to resolve some of it. And then other things just remain because I think he is a real problem for them.
Yeah. So I suppose this should probably be a good time for me. I think I might have glossed over this in the when I introduced you, but you're also a priest in the Church of England, so you kind of fit nicely into this Catholic Protestant continuum, and that's kind of where you're fitting in, and uh, I do think to some extent, even in the Catholic Church, in spite of or despite Pope Francis, there is this sense like let's not talk about the devil. It's not pleasant. Do you ever watch the History Channel, or did you ever watch the History Channel?
No.
Okay, good. uh, I watched. Oh boy, when I was like in my probably early 20s, I watched it a lot, and they would have these really stupid um series on about like the devil through the ages and stuff, and for them I get the impression looking back on it now that for these historians on the History Channel, it's like the devil was a caricature.
Yeah.
horns
Yeah.
and red body and pitchfork and, all that stuff and burning people and stuff like that next to him.
Yeah.
Um, but like you say, for in this early period, certainly in the fourth century and earlier, and subsequently too, I'm certain, the devil was a real problem. And, whether or not these writers provided a definitive solution to that problem, probably not. Maybe they didn't think they had to.
Right.
But they were trying to work out this world in which we live. If we think that God is provident and that we say that, on the cross,
Yeah.
Jesus defeats death, how do we account for all this stuff that's
Yeah.
happening? Is this the devil who's doing it? Is that avoiding personal responsibility if we say it is the devil who does this stuff?
Yeah.
The first story you talk about in your book is a famine that happened. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the year was 368.
Yep.
Is that the year? So
So
how
we think.
so okay, well let's just say 368 for simplicity's sake. Circa 368.
Indeed. Yeah.
Um, how do the Cappadocians respond to this famine in a way that helps us to think about the way they problematized the devil and his action in the world?
This, honestly, John, this was the most exciting discovery for me that it was early on and it made everything else worth pursuing and wrestling with. Um, because it was when I was first addressing and trying to test this theory around does he work as an explanation for everything that's going wrong in the world for them? I'd read it in many, many contemporary sort of histories of the devil. The early Christians, they think this. And I thought, okay, so let me find an actual problem, which
Mhm.
would be a famine where people are starving, and I will read all of their responses to it and see how they're using the devil in order to rationalize the awfulness of everything that's going
Mhm.
on. And so Susan Holman had included some fantastic translations in her book on the Cappadocians and poverty. I think it might even be about 20 years ago she published it now. Really good books with Oxford University Press. So I sort of got some of the sort of background from her book in terms of what was going on with the famine, read around it, and it turns out that Gregory of Nazianzus wrote, it was his oration 16. He wrote an oration responding to it. We think that Basil's that God is not the cause of evil,
Mhm.
so called, entitled. Norna Verna Harrison's got a nice little translation of it in one of her books on the human condition. We think that responds to the famine, and then Gregory of Nyssa wrote a couple as well that responded to it. So we have this sense of sort of three different responses to this famine. And so I first read the orations. I'd read them before because when you're a Cappadocian scholar, you tend to read this stuff, but I'd never read them in view of this question. So I was reading through, and I started with Gregory of Nazianzus because he's my go-to, not because he's first. And I sort of started with the sort of, okay, so Old Testament, yeah, all very nice. He'll get to the devil halfway through, maybe. No, no, kept going, kept going, kept going. No mention of the devil at all, at all. And I was like, well, this is no good because this is wrong. The devil's meant to help with you understanding what's going on with this. Like, why are you not turning to this particularly useful character? So I said, okay, what he did do, I mean, a lot of it wouldn't necessarily land today with our views of providence and that kind of thing. What he did do was work through the Old Testament and look through questions of suffering that way. It's a lovely oration. It's well worth reading. But it didn't help me at all in terms of what the devil was doing in all of that. Then I went to Gregory of Nyssa and he mentions the devil, but not in a way that means the devil explains anything. And then I went to Basil and he does again mention the devil quite a lot in his sermon, but again, not as an explanation. The devil isn't the cause of any of it. Sin. I'm looking at your friend in the background.
Yeah, he's squawking at me. He wants to go for a walk, but you're going to have to wait. You wait.
Oh,
I'm talking now. Go away.
he's beautiful. Um, so yeah, I sort of looked at those three, and in that sense, the devil doesn't resolve any questions for them. He doesn't explain anything, not when it comes to problems of suffering. And he's therefore not any kind of resolution to theodicy,
Mm,
despite the fact that that's so often how he's
yeah.
cast. There's definitely a lot of conversation around how he's involved with sin, for
Hmm.
sure. But that's very different from the sort of existential kinds of suffering that we would see today, like tsunamis and famines and earthquakes, and nowhere to be seen for any of those kinds of natural disasters. Is a very specific kind of relationship with humankind and sin, but not responsible for anything outside of that at all. It was fascinating to me.
So not responsible for external circumstances, external events. That kind of
No,
reminds me, um, Origin has in book 3 of On First Principles, he discusses, this issue kind of abstractly and asks, if the devil is responsible for the evils that happen in the world. And his response is when it comes to external circumstances, no, the devil's not responsible. How then do they provide an explanation for the events, or do they leave it up to chance? How do they answer that question?
um, probably in ways that wouldn't be satisfactory for most contemporary theologians, or many. Most of it sits under the idea of, well, under the doctrine of providence.
Okay.
So we see them talking about judgment. What's really interesting, I found, especially with Gregory of Nazianzus, is he employs lament a lot, and basically pleads with God on behalf of the people. So there is a sense to which he's not fully on board with the fact that this really is a just circumstance.
Mhm.
But on the whole, it sits within the doctrine of
Okay.
providence. Yeah.
All right. So if the devil then isn't responsible for external events, he must have something to do with internal events. And here we really get into, like, early Christian asceticism and
Yeah.
struggles against sin and the passions. Where does the devil fit in there in Cappadocian thought? He features prominently in Athanasius's Life of Antony, for example, in Antony's
For sure.
ascetic formation. Does he have a role in Cappadocian ascetic formation?
Yeah, and the way you can see it sort of playing out is the way that they talk about what they think of as the church's war against the devil.
Mm.
I found it really interesting. Baptism is like your biggest defense and
Yeah.
shield, but it's not going to stop him coming after you afterwards. The only one of the three that I found that was actively let's go after him was Basil. And there's a delightful, at least I found it utterly delightful, paragraph where Basil's talking about basically, we can do all of these things to defend ourselves, but what we really want to do is cause him some pain.
Mhm.
So let's just hurt him back. And I quite liked the idea of a church at war that's actually doing a little bit more than just trying to protect itself
Yeah.
against this evil being and fallen angel. And that's actually like, yeah, no, let's just actually cause him some pain.
Yeah.
But you tend to see that far more, I think, with Basil than the other two. But they use so much of Ephesians. So you have them talking about the armor of God is really, really important in terms of how they're thinking about how do human beings protect themselves from being influenced by the devil. They'll talk about the kinds of sins that we're most likely to be susceptible to. For Gregory of Nyssa, fame. I was so interested in this. Fame is a really big one
Hmm.
because, of course, the devil sort of bringing the tradition through, the devil wanted to be spectacular and wanted to be adored and worshipped.
Hmm.
And so that then becomes one of the primary ways he's going to tempt human beings is we all want to be special. We all want to be, the celebrity.
Yeah.
And so he's really pushing against that kind of idea when he's talking about how we remain, holy, set apart. And they sort of frame all of that within when they're talking about him. We could come on to naming maybe a bit later, but they use the idea of him being the ruler of the world ruler.
Yeah.
That comes up a lot when they're talking about those kinds of issues, because fundamentally we're living in a world that is both defeated and Jesus is victorious, but there's also this world ruler
Hmm.
who, albeit might be counterfeit, but is still walking around ruling things to some extent. He's governing in a way that wants all of these sort of anti-vices, if you like, to be flourishing. So that's how they tend to talk about him when they're talking about the kind of ways in which we can push back at him. There's a lot of it, but it's all scattered. So you haven't got an easy go-to like Life of Anthony, where you can
Yeah.
say, oh yeah, if you read this, this will give you all the
Yeah.
answers to
Yeah.
this particular question. It's scattered all the way through. Even in Against Eunomius, where you wouldn't necessarily, where I didn't necessarily expect to see those kinds of conversations happening.
Yeah.
So it's in the theological treatises, it's in the homilies, it's in the poems, it's in the letters, everywhere. And I think one of the things I found the trickiest, and as I said earlier, I didn't always resolve this, is sometimes it's just not obvious which enemy they're talking about. Whether they're talking about the devil, whether they're talking about the emperor, whether they're talking about a personification of envy or death, and whether they're deliberately merging all of those. I have a friend who talks about productive ambiguity, where it's sort of ambiguous, but that's actually even in itself doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
So that was sort of made it like an extra bit of fun, really, in terms of when you're reading the texts.
I want to go back to Basil because you said, Basil does something quite interesting. He says, let's go out and attack it. And that does remind me of Antony. I remember I hadn't thought about this before, but a professor of mine at St. Michael's in Toronto, Jim Ginther, said, they don't go, these ascetics didn't go to the desert to flee from the devil. They
Sure.
went out there to attack the devil because that's where the land of the dead was. They went out there to do combat. What you said about Basil kind of reminds me a little bit of that, which would make sense, I guess, because he wrote these ascetic rules, or these
Yeah.
rules for people who were embarking upon an ascetic lifestyle, which was
Yeah.
a life of doing direct combat with these things, which suggests that in this internal struggle for virtue against vice, I would suspect that Basil would not say that the devil is the cause of our vices.
No.
It's us, right? So can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah.
That's really important, I think.
Yeah, and they would all say that.
Yeah.
They are very, very clear on we have a responsibility to resist.
Hmm.
I think where Basil makes it most explicit is when he's in his homily that God is not the cause of evil, because he actually goes through all the different kinds of evils and then he talks about the fall and very clearly says, oh, this is on Adam,
Hmm.
actually. Yes, of course, the devil's involved, but this is not on the devil in that sense. It's on humanity.
Hmm.
And that initial responsibility then continues. And so it's really up to us to be praying, to be, practicing the virtues, all of those kinds of things. I think the praying also gives it away in terms of how we're praying the Lord's Prayer. in terms of how they're understanding how the Lord's Prayer is prayed.
Hmm.
So in most translations nowadays, it's deliver us from evil.
Yep.
For Gregory of Nyssa, very specifically, he talks a lot about deliver us from the evil
The
one.
evil one. Yep.
And that just, I mean, obviously that changes so much what that prayer then looks like and what it means, because suddenly it's something very specific that you're being delivered from.
Yeah.
I mean, evil, we could argue all day about what evil is and what it
Mhm.
means and what's included in within evil and what isn't, that kind of thing. But if you're talking about a fallen angel, then you're also talking about being delivered from a specific set of temptations, from a specific way of life, and from a specific kind of governance and ruling, right? A sort of a spiritual apathy and a spiritual delusion, that kind of thing. It makes that prayer much, much sharper.
Yeah.
And certainly for them, that's how that prayer was being prayed. Yeah.
Do they ever do a figurative interpretation of the Exodus? That's one of Origen's favorites. Like,
Yep.
it's the spiritual Pharaoh and it's the spiritual Pharaoh's army, by which he means the devil and his demons,
Very
essentially,
much so.
that are
Yeah.
pursuing the soul of the individual through
Yeah.
the desert. They do that as well.
They do. Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on the Song of Songs,
Oh,
which
okay.
again I was really surprised about, because when I was reading those homilies again when I mean, really early on, when I was sort of going through everything to see if he's anywhere where we might not expect him to be. Once I'd realized he wasn't where I expected him to be. So once I'd realized he wasn't in the homilies on the famine in the way that I was expecting him to show up, I then thought, oh, well, hang on, let me read now. So I had a very odd approach to research in that sense, because my next strategy was then let me read everything that I know I wouldn't expect him to be in, having not seen him where he should be, in my opinion. And so I went to the homilies of Song and Songs, because we all know they're all about beauty and truth. And, so much work has been done on those homilies. I mean, the secondary literature is a delight because there's
Yeah.
lots of it compared to, say, some of the stuff on Basil, where I'm talking to myself because no one else has written on it.
That is a really a misfortune in Cappadocian scholarship. There's not
It's
enough on
just,
Basil. Not
oh my
enough.
gosh. I sort of plead to readers, yeah, listeners, like write on Basil, because we need more on Basil. So it was easy in the sense of an easy way in, because there's so much written on those homilies. And so I read through the homilies, I read through all the secondary literature. Um, and I was really shocked at the fact that the devil is specifically mentioned and addressed in two-thirds of them. So there's 15 homilies, he's in 10, very explicitly. And so is the theme of spiritual warfare. And I was like, what's this doing here? They're supposed to be about beauty. And they are. And that's sort of where that idea again of the deification comes in,
Okay.
because the closer you become like the more you become like God, the closer you arrive to God's presence, thinking in terms of Nissa's ideas, the more the devil will be interested in you. And so, of course, once you sort of get your head around that bit, of course, he's going to be present in those homilies. It's just not necessarily how, certainly I, as a modern thinker, tended to think about ideas of coming to know God. So he's sort of scattered all the way through those. And I think it's the third homily that Nissa talks about how Pharaoh is chasing
Okay.
and basically that we are being delivered
Mhm.
from. But yeah, that's a theme it comes up a lot, the
Yeah.
crossing of the Sea in all three of them. Yeah.
Another theme you talk about in your book is the church doing battle with the devil, or the devil doing battle against the church, however you want to frame it.
Yeah.
Um, uh, that is a theme we see in Origen, for example, where he talks about in his first homily on Psalm 77, where he gets into discrepancies in various copies of biblical books, like
Yep.
a scribal error in a copy of the Gospel of Matthew, or some kind of apparent inconsistency in one of the Old Testament historical books. And he says the devil uses these as an opportunity to sow division and schism in the church. Um, I'm curious what the Cappadocians do. Uh, are they similar? They seem in your book to have a sense that the devil is actually at work, not just with an individual soul, but
Yeah.
with the church writ large.
Yeah. I was fascinated by this. He really hates the church. Really, really hates the church. And this is connected to salvation because he doesn't want anyone flourishing. And the church, in theory, is the means to that,
Mhm.
right? When it's doing what it should and could and all the rest of it. There's a beautiful letter that Gregory of Nyssa writes to some presbyters who need to get on and choose a bishop. And he says, you need to do this because they're all arguing about who they want, clearly, in behind the scenes. And he's like, you need to do this. Otherwise, the devil's going to make a laughing stock of all of you because you just so divided that it's going to cause him too much joy, really.
Mhm.
You're just making yourselves a and so there's sort of you see it in that kind of way planning out. Gregory of Nazianzus talks a lot about unity. That's a really big one for him, peace in the church.
Mhm.
And often you'll see him mentioning how it's the devil that wants disunity. Um, and the same for Basil. The question of who the church is, and back to the homilies on the Song of Songs again. Gregory of Nyssa has a beautiful sort of all the way through a thread of we really need to know who we are. And by that, he means we need to know what it means to be made according to the image of God. So, not unlike Nazianzus in that
Mhm.
sense,
Mhm.
because actually that's what he's after. Because if we don't know who we are, then we can be tossed and turned in any direction. If we know who we are and we have a strong sense of identity, both as the church and as human individuals, then it's going to be a lot easier to resist him. And so the question, not just of what the church does, but who the church is in Christ, that becomes a really important one. And it's something that we as the church really can't afford to not know. It's not sort of like an added extra or, oh, it's nice if you understand that you're made according to the image of God, because that gets bandied around a lot today.
Oh, yeah.
It's a phrase that we hear just all the time. It's like, oh, we're special because we're made according to the image of God, almost ad nauseam to the
Mhm.
point where you stop listening.
It's a
But
cliche.
back in the fourth century, this is still a radical idea, right? That humans could be like emperors, essentially, and divine. Um, and it's definitely part of the core identity of humanity in the church in that way.
Mhm.
It isn't something that you can afford to be fluffy about.
Okay. So this conversation has continually drifted towards this question of deification and like what do we do now? Before we
Yeah,
get there, before we get there, we haven't talked about a figure who features in your book, Macrina.
yeah.
Talk a little bit about Macrina and her contribution to this discussion.
Oh, this is so. I just got so excited when I was reading this, what's reported in her voice, right? And that's a whole
Because she
other.
doesn't have any writings of her own.
She doesn't,
Yeah.
no. And this is a whole other conversation that I don't want to deviate on now as to whether she should or shouldn't be included, right? And
Mhm.
it's hotly debated.
Yeah.
But um, I chose to include what is attributed to Macrina by her brother because I think it solves one of the possible ambiguities that's happening in Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on the Lord's Prayer. So there's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful moment where he talks about obviously, we have the Heavenly Father. You're praying the Lord's Prayer to the Heavenly Father.
Mhm.
Um, and so to counterbalance that, he brings in the idea of the subterranean Father.
Uh,
And it's katakthanios in the Greek.
okay.
For anyone who's listening that knows Greek. And that same term is used in Philippians, and this is where Macrina comes in, because in Philippians it talks about every knee will bow
Mhm.
to above the earth, every knee that's above the earth, on the earth, and below the earth. And this is this idea of what's below the earth. So he refers to it's that same term in Greek, this what's below the earth. And Macrina, Macrina in her, oh my gosh, it isn't in the life. It's in, I think it's in On the Soul and the
On the
Resurrection.
soul and the resurrection.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's where she's talking about basically the different order of creatures. And
Can I just interject for 1 second? Just to
yeah,
the audience might not know. So on the soul and the resurrection is
yep,
from Gregory of Nyssa, but
yep.
it's written as a dialogue between him and his sister Macrina on the subject.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Appreciate that. Yes. And so she's sort of teasing out what happens to all of these different creatures at the end and that kind of thing. And you have this very clear sense from what she's saying that even the katakthanios at the end, there's the potential that even that might be restored. And so I think it's a really interesting one because all through the homily, he gives this idea that if we submit to this subterranean Father in the way that we should be submitting to the Heavenly Father, then eventually we're going to become so like him that
Mm,
we actually become what you could call diabolic.
okay.
And so my question at the end is, well, how far can we go in that journey? How far can human be? Where's the end? Does it, what does that mean? Because we know elsewhere he talks about how in his On the Making of Humankind, he talks about limits of evil, right?
Mhm.
So I was like, well, here you don't say anything, Gregory. You don't give me a where do we end in this? You know, what are the possibilities? Do we just tip off an edge of um diabolicalism? You know,
Yeah.
what's the goal? And it's really Macrina who just beautifully sort of teases out and offers some possibilities that even if you've gone really far off the edge, there's still a possibility of things being resolved at the last. Um, I'm still left with the question how.
Hmm.
And that was a big one for me with Origin as well, with
Yeah.
that sense of, well, there's a possibility, but really, if you've willed evil that for that long,
Hmm.
how are you going to turn that around?
Yeah.
I don't think that one gets resolved in any of the um, uh, in any of the sources that I was reading. So that's sort of one of the things we were left with in terms of an open question.
My sense, and I haven't done much with this, but my sense for Origin, for him, it's really a problem of, well, maybe it's not a problem, um, but he has to um, champion the goodness of God because I think for him, if the ultimate end of somebody who willed evil for so long that it was completely impossible for them to turn themselves around
Yeah,
would diminish the power of God's goodness and God's grace to effect that kind of change. And so he will go on to say something, I can't remember exactly how he puts it, but he frames it as the question um, we know that pursuing virtue is the best thing you can do. But the question is it better to be idle and maybe indifferent and do nothing,
yeah,
or to give in to the vices that are kind of tempting you? And there he says, well, it's probably better to give in to the vices, oddly enough, because eventually you're going to come around to see, hey, look, I've got a problem and I need God's help. Whereas if you remain idle or indifferent, I can't remember how he puts it. Um, you're there's no incentive to change because you haven't reached rock bottom,
yeah.
which is very relevant, I think, for contemporary discussions of things like addiction and mental health and stuff like that. Um, is it better, to withhold support for somebody who's in the throes of addiction, and hope that, they finally recognize this? Or should we step in to intervene and help, bit by bit, even if it's, allowing them a drink every once in a while or something to that effect, um, I don't know where I was going with that. That's just something I've been thinking about for a long time. But anyway, so with Origin, I don't really think I think what would prevent him from saying that it's not the case that somebody can habituate to evil so much that they can never convert towards virtue.
Yep.
Not just because we're a rational being, but because God's grace and goodness is so strong that eventually it's going to bring everybody into submission to God's will. Where
Yeah.
do the Cappadocians stand on that issue?
On the issue of submitting to God's will.
Well,
And the,
so is it for the Cappadocians, could you habituate to evil so much that you wouldn't be able to turn yourself around and to be open to God's grace?
so for Basil, yes,
Oh,
you
really?
you
Okay.
could.
Hmm.
For Gregory, he's not sure. As in Gregory of Nazianzus, sorry,
Yep.
that gives
Yep.
something away there. And for Gregory of Nyssa, it will most likely be resolved.
Okay. Yeah, because
They don't actually take the same approach to this. It's really interesting.
yeah.
They sort of over the question of certainly whether the devil's going to end up being saved, as
Hmm.
I guess we could describe him as the most evil
Hmm.
of all of the angels. Um, they're not necessarily resolving that question in the same way, which
Hmm.
I found was really interesting and helpful because it emphasizes and exposes how difficult this is to resolve,
Hmm.
right? That
Yep.
whichever way you land, there's going to be a counter issue
Yep.
that really is quite tricky with all three of them. Yeah, but they basically give you almost like the fan of
Mm.
options that you could land on. Yeah.
And
Basil's the sternest, without a doubt.
Basil is, yeah, and I think Nadzianzen would probably agree with you. We see in their letter exchanges, Basil got on Gregory's nerves a little bit.
For
I think
sure.
shut up
We
and
have
leave
some
me
very
alone.
passive aggressive
Yeah,
writing
yeah,
from
yeah.
him.
But Nissa now, of course, we have Ilaria Ramelli's
Yep.
massive work on apokatastasis,
Yeah.
universal salvation, and she makes a big deal of Nissa being this universalist.
Yeah.
Um, so, can you talk a little bit for Nissa? How is it exactly, or what does he say about the possibility for the devil's salvation?
So in the catechetical oration, um, it's might I think it might even be section 26 of the second. Anyway, in there, he's moving through how the devil is beaten on the cross,
Hmm.
and that's where we have the famous what became the infamous almost fishhook motif.
Yep.
Um, and in that, he talks about how basically there's a possibility of things coming right at the end, because he's basically says that even ultimately, even the devil will see that whilst effectively some kind of trick was played on him, it was for his own good.
Hmm.
And so a few people have challenged it, and so it's not gone completely unchallenged, but definitely the majority of scholarship is agreed that Nissa would be very, very, very up with the idea of the devil being saved ultimately. Yeah.
How could a good God deceive a rational being? That's kind of a problem that they have to address, isn't it? Like,
It is.
how
I
can
mean,
we justify God's deception?
it depends who you ask.
Yeah.
So for Gregory of Nazianzus, he doesn't. And he's very, very clear about that and spends a lot of time in It's Oration 39 on the baptism of Christ. Spends a lot of time teasing out what that looks like. It's chapter 4, and honestly, I think it was the most fun chapter I've ever written in my life. So I do almost want to say to anyone, if you pick up anything, please go and read chapter 4, because I delve into why Gregory can sort of argue what he does there. For Gregory of Nyssa, he's much more actually no, God does.
Yeah.
And it's really I was just originally I was sort of I read through all the secondary because again about 3 people have written on Gregory of Nazianzus with this issue, even across German, Italian, and everything else. With Gregory of Nyssa, yet again, there's so much secondary scholarship, it's unbelievable around this particular question. And so that a lot of that was really helpful. Some of it was sort of this is a shocking thing for Gregory to do, and what could it be he have been thinking? Um, so I went into some of the world of ancient fishing.
Mm.
That was actually really interesting. So it turns out, and I hadn't known this before, that Oppian wrote I shouldn't call it a fishing manual because it's a 5 book epic poem, but it felt like a fishing manual that was just wonderfully mythological for the ancients, right? In terms of how you catch fish and what it means to live in a world of peace where fishermen are catching fish and what you need to do that. So once I read that, so there were some questions around, what we do with fishing, then read the Bible,
Mhm.
which, again, fish are all the way through the New
Yeah.
Testament, and how that's dealt with. Also, Job comes into it,
Hmm.
catching a fish with a fish hook kind of thing. That comes up. It's one of the questions God asked to Job. Um, Once I'd looked at all the background, and then when you look at what Gregory of Nyssa's doing with, he starts arguing it from the point of view of God's attributes, because he says a God that's wise, just, um, good, is is going to choose this, is basically going to choose this because of the fact that in the end it's going to be it's going to be the best choice because even through this, the devil himself could be saved.
Mm.
And so he's looking at a question through attributes. I came across something really interesting in Plato's Republic as I was reading for this around why gods don't deceive. So Plato's really clear in his Republic around humans in a moral, just society, there might be reasons for deception, and he justifies it and sort of talks about it at length. And then he's very, very clear, but the gods don't deceive.
Mm.
But what I found really interesting is Plato doesn't justify it on the basis of morality. So he doesn't say the gods don't deceive because it's wrong to deceive. He says the gods don't deceive because they don't need to,
Mm.
because they're gods. And what you see with Gregory of Nyssa, all through the catechetical oration, building up to the language around the fishhook and the question of deceit, is he's very clear to emphasize this is not necessary,
Mm.
not necessary. And so it's almost as though he had the Republic in mind. I can't prove that, obviously. He doesn't cite it, but this idea of God does this, but it's not necessary at all. He's doing it because he wants to be able to save all human beings and the devil. It's sort of it's an interesting way of working out what's a tricky issue, but then appealing lots to scripture. So Job comes up a lot in that.
Very interesting that you speculate as to whether Nissa had the Republic on hand when he was writing this, because um, uh, in my most 2 episodes ago, I had Father Isidore Katzos on, and we were talking about um, the Cappadocian literature, Basil and Gregory on the Hexameron. And he thinks that it was absolutely certain that Nyssa had the Timaeus with him
Oh, for
as
sure.
he's composing his homilies or his discourse on the Hexameron, not homilies for Nyssa, a discourse on it, exegetical treatment of it. Um, I don't see any reason. So if that's true, and I actually find that quite convincing, I don't see any reason why we can't also say that he probably did have a copy of the Republic with him as he's writing these things. Sometimes, it strikes me that in a lot of traditional scholarship, there used to be an assumption that it was because they had such good strategies for memorization and they could just remember all of these things. But then if you look at like some of the quotes that Origen gives of Plato or somebody in Contra Celsum, I don't care what your memory is, you're not going to remember those things unless you have the text with you at hand. So
Yeah,
that does kind of tell us a little bit about the culture, I
it
think,
does.
the material culture in which these individuals were working.
Yeah, yeah. I'm always cautious, but if I had to place bets, which I don't, of course,
I don't either, I lose.
I would be willing to bet on
Yeah.
it.
Okay, so let's draw things to a close here and talk about like what comes next. So you have this article. Now, is it out or is it coming out in Modern Theology?
No, it will come out.
It's coming
Yeah,
out. Okay.
it'll be later this year. I don't know exactly which issue, but it will be in Modern Theology this year.
Okay, talk about that article. That's the one on Origin, correct? And
It includes Origin.
it
Yeah,
includes Origin. Okay, and
yeah,
his homily on Psalm 81.
yes.
Okay.
So, for a very long time, I have wanted to take some of the ideas that I've been seeing in these texts. For a long time, I wasn't sure whether it was going to be another complete book, and it probably still will be at some stage, or just an article. But I started with an article because that seemed the most sensible thing to do.
Hmm.
Um, I wanted to sort of say, not how can we just lift it up and put it down in the contemporary world, because I'm well aware there's a lot of movement between the fourth century and the 21st century. Nevertheless, I do think there are some really valuable ideas that I then wanted to develop myself in a more constructive kind of way. So, what I'm not doing is saying, these are the things that I've seen in Origin and the Cappadocians, and here's how we move those ideas exactly across.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
saying, this is what lends itself to something that we might want to think about now. So, as well as reading a lot of the patristic material on the devil, I've also spent a long time reading a lot of modern work on the devil. There's a medieval gap somewhere in my work, but so I was specifically focusing on the people who have actually genuinely tried to retrieve an idea of how do we think about the devil in modern theology today. And I looked at where those ideas were struggling a little bit. So Ratzinger talks about the devil as unperson,
Mm,
and he situates that idea within his whole idea of what it means to be person, right? Um, Robert Jensen wrote just one essay and then developed it a little bit in his two-volume of systematics, but not a lot, where he talks about the devil as person,
mm,
and then talks about how he is a parasitic kind of person. And then most recently, Philip Ziegler talks about the devil in ideas of being anarchic and toys with the idea of the devil with person, but doesn't land too firmly either way. And in thinking about it, in conversation with, I think, the things that I've been thinking about with the Cappadocians, I thought actually, I think personhood is possibly just not the right category for us to be trying to assimilate the devil into modern theology. It's not quite the right language because we're struggling. Whenever we're trying to say the devil is person or is a person, we're really struggling because immediately he's everything a person isn't
mm,
or couldn't be. And so we're immediately really struggling for the language. But what we're wanting to say is that he's real in some way, but we just need the language for what do we mean by that? So on the basis of the homily on the psalm that you were talking about at the beginning, and on also Gregory of Nyssa's work in these homilies on the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer, which is his two series of homilies that are on the New Testament. I was thinking about how they talk about the devil very much in terms of the idea of mask, face,
Mm.
without much behind. So using and playing with the idea of prosopon, I said, well, how about we think about the devil as persona as opposed to person? So not in the way that sort of psychology talks about the persona as a very, I mean, persona studies, that's a very
Yeah.
specific,
Yep.
discipline today. So not branching off into that, but this idea of something that personhood and person just doesn't quite catch and cover. So something else, something where there's this idea of an unstable ontology as opposed to something that's really firm and predictable and solid that you could say the devil is this, and this.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because it's never quite clear in my mind when you're reading through the patristic texts, once he's fallen and once he's a fallen angel, quite what that means he is in terms of what, what then, how that's described. And so, as I say, I'm not translating it directly because they don't talk about him as a persona, because that idea didn't exist in the same way. But they do talk a lot about how theatre and the world of illusion and delusion is really related to him very, very closely. And I liked that because it I think it means it's just a little bit harder to pin him
Yeah.
down. So that's basically where I went with that. And I used Origen's work on the theatre in that homily and then the two homilies on Gregory of Nyssa to suggest maybe we just need a new category altogether. And whilst I don't think they're necessarily creating that category themselves, what I think their work does is lend itself to a grammar that we can now pick up and start to actually work with and build in the contemporary world that I think would mean that we could bring the devil into conversations in contemporary theology in a way that would cause fewer problems than the categories of personhood.
That's so interesting. It gets me thinking a little bit. Um, Samuel Rubinson in oh boy, Norway. I think is he Norway or is he in Sweden? I can't remember now. Um, I actually want to say Sweden.
Oh, yeah.
Lund is Sweden, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so he really revolutionized, I think, our understanding of Egyptian monasticism in the tradition of Antony. And he's got that great book from the mid 90s. I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head, but he translates some of the extant letters from Saint Anthony that he wrote to like other monks. And a theme that keeps turning up in those letters is know thyself. You know,
Right.
and
Yeah.
you talked earlier, about you know knowing that we are the
Very much
image
so.
of God, right?
Yeah.
And how that's kind of been popularized to the point where it's just a cliche now. But for them, it was very real. It's like, know that you are in God's image. And so if we think about uh, prosopa masks that we wear, on
Yeah.
the one hand, if we act in accordance with who we are, in God's image. If we know ourselves, we wear the mask of God, or as Origen would say, the mask of Christ,
Yeah.
and then we become more and more conformed to that to the point
Yes.
where we're deified. However, then we get into this issue of like the deceiver, the devil as this one who's deceiving us into thinking we are something we are not. You
Yeah.
know, and so then when we do that, when we don't know ourselves, when we're deceived about who we are in God's image, and maybe we're strict materialists or something like that, or hedonists or something, we
Yeah.
wear this mask that is uh, deceiving, I
Yeah,
think, very deceptive of who
yeah,
we are as the human person. I think there's probably something there that we can work with in contemporary
yeah,
theological scholarship on this issue. I don't
yeah.
know
I
what your
hope
thoughts are on
so.
that, but yeah,
I'd like to see all of this developed for
yeah,
sure. I mean, most of what I've been doing, both with the book and with the article, is trying to launch a conversation really that is only happening in fragments.
yeah,
Because I do think, especially where we are in the world today, it is something that we would benefit from thinking through, rethinking through,
yeah,
actually, and getting rid of some of the caricatures for sure.
yeah.
And yeah, it's something that I could talk about for a very long time, though.
Well, Reverend Thomas, thank you very much for this very fun and insightful conversation. Yes, hopefully people who watch or listen to this will be inspired to pick up the baton and do some work and carry the conversation forward as well.
And hopefully read the book.
And hopefully read the book, which you said should be coming out
July this summer. Yeah, the
July
book's
this
out in
summer.
July.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I will put a link to it
thank you.
in the video description so
Excellent.
people who watch can go take a look at it. Reverend Thomas, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.